So we've gone from comedians getting coffee in cars
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
or 50-year-old guys walking with sticks.
Actually, today on Cleaning Up, we've got a great episode, which is an AI data center in Portugal
Okay.
that I visited, and we got drone shots and the whole thing.
All right. So the difference with that particular podcast is that that's one that people actually watch. We're hoping to
Yes.
get there. It's a long road, huh?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm very pleased with it, but so we've just gone through 1 million cumulative downloads on
Oh, wow.
YouTube.
So Michael, the second part of this excursion is 12 months ago, I bought a dilapidated, deserted, very typical Norwegian cabin because I wanted to live close to work, which is the city and the airport, and close to where my ex-wife lives because of my kids. But I didn't want to live in the middle of the city. And I've been geeking out on this energy stuff now for long enough. I thought, what would it actually take and how well would it work? So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little walk in the woods, and then we're going to go check this place out and see if it's comfortable enough to have a conversation and have dinner there. Right? So like one stat that I'm a little proud of, you mentioned solar a little while ago. I have a huge solar installation of 5 400 kilowatt panels.
Okay.
Not very big. But my electricity for the year is 60% from that. And we have all the stuff that you'd have in a normal house.
Do you have does that cover a heat pump or not?
Absolutely not.
Because you're heating with wood.
No chance. No chance.
No, yeah.
No chance, right? So a bunch of IoT, all that kind of stuff, right? Trying to make it possible to manage and some degree of efficiency and stuff like that. But I'd love to have a heat pump in the future. So this whole project becomes like, what do we need to do to get it livable? What do you then need to do to get it manageable? What can you then later do to try to make it efficient?
Yeah.
Step by step, right? So we'll take a look at that and continue the conversation.
That's great. That's a great project. And I suspect I'll be learning a lot. But I also have a project. It's not up in a place like this, just outside London. I would love to go fully off grid.
Uh-huh.
But the challenge is heating in winter. Absolutely challenges heating in
Right.
winter. And so therefore we just probably, I don't want to say you can't do it, but
Right.
you have to really, really contort yourself to do it.
Exactly, right? So I made a decision there, and we haven't talked about, we talked a little bit about thermodynamics, and we uncovered my ignorance to it, right? But when you try to make energy or you try to do work or you try to move things with fossil fuels, there's often quite a bit of waste because of the heat waste, right?
Right.
And we can dig into that. But if you're trying to actually create heat, then a liquid fuel is not always the worst idea. So I'd be curious to hear what you think of HVO 100 or a biofuel.
Yeah.
That's how I've solved it here. So yes, we burn wood, but we're in a, let's just say a poorly managed forest at a north latitude, 59 degrees north, where there's more softwood than hardwood, right? So
Why do you say poorly managed?
yeah, so poorly managed forest. So here's an example right here. This spruce tree right here that you see is dead. It's, from what I understand, a combination of multiple factors, like it always is. One of them is a bark beetle infestation. And the second is that after World War II, this area was reasonably clear and it was all reforested. And it was reforested with spruce monoculture, independent of soil types, et cetera. And you'll see it a lot as we're walking through the woods. There's relatively little dirt here.
Right.
So there's not a lot of room for roots to grow on trees that become large. And so over time, the forest just met its natural limit. So now there's a process going on where the city is clear cutting some of it, replanting with a combination of oak, some spruce, and some other things.
But when it comes to just providing heating for your cabin, there's enough wood around. And they're, especially if they are clear cutting, then surely getting a couple of truckloads of that every so often wouldn't be hard.
A lot of it's been standing dead for a long time. Right. So when you pick it up, it's not very heavy.
Yeah.
So the energy density compared to, like as an example, in the kitchen here, you'll see there's one of these Italian wood stoves that's also an oven and heats water. And they specify how much energy content you should have in the wood to use that stove.
Right.
And there's a heavy preference for hardwood, which we have very little of here.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like a solvable, because, if the wood is light, maybe it's dry, maybe it's not. I don't know. I'm not but you certainly got wood around. And
yeah,
it's just if you compare it to using HVO.
Yeah.
I mean, that you can also do that. And that's a good solution, but it does require a lot more processing and a lot more land use.
True, exactly. My understanding here, though, and this is something that I would need to fact check, but what I believe I've read about the HVO that you buy from Circle K here in Norway, because it's also used as heating oil,
Right.
is that it is primarily from food
Food waste. Right.
right, and not from any direct farming.
Yeah, so what you got there is a little window into a really important conversation, which is what is the role of bio in the future? You know, it's been bubbling around for the 20 odd years that I've been doing this, and you know, clearly hasn't got the same momentum as, you know, wind, solar batteries, electric cars, heat pumps, etc. But in particular, I think, you know, now that hopefully there's a bit more general understanding that the answer is not hydrogen.
Yeah.
There are these difficult use cases to electrify, and it's pretty much going to have to be some form of bio. So I think we're going to have to make peace with the idea of using bio, which has become very unfashionable, but I don't see how we sort of get by without it. And then the question is, where do we want to use it? Because it is probably limited in volume.
Right.
And, you know, right now, to be clear, not every single, but almost all use of biofuels is utterly pointless because it's going into land transportation. And almost all use of biogas is pointless because it's either going into land transportation through CNG trucks,
right,
or you know, bio CNG trucks, or just being used to generate electricity. It's just, you know, makes no sense. Not taking advantage. The whole point about the bio solutions is that they can be stored and used remotely or in aeroplanes or ships or whatever. So to use bio in a way that doesn't do that is crazy. You know, is an off-grid cabin a good use of bio? I suspect you'll find that when, you know, an off-grid cabin surrounded by trees using HVO is sort of a bit mad.
Well, there's another side to this too, which I don't know, maybe it's selfish, but if I was to use wood, I'd pretty much have to sit by the stove 24 hours a day.
Well, then you got the wrong sort of stove. That can be fixed.
Right.
That can be fixed. Now, the issue is actually there's a different one, which is, of course, the air quality implications.
Indeed.
Maybe for yourself, or, you know, you can get modern stoves that combust wood at, you know, really high temperatures, full combustion, but they still do produce some particulates. And, you know, the worry is if everybody is doing it, and also not everybody will have the best technology maintained, cleaned, etc. So you worry about air quality, maybe not out here, but in any kind of, you know, anywhere where there's dense population, then you do worry about it.
Exactly.
But there's nothing perfect.
No.
The problem is if we're going to, you know, if every single new addition to the energy system has to be measured against the, you know, the metric of perfection, well, then we're probably screwed.
We're probably screwed, right? And
nothing is going to be perfect. So wind and solar take a huge land area, electric vehicles, lots of critical minerals and so on. Are they vastly, vastly better than sticking with fossil? Yes, vastly. Are they perfect? No.
No. But I mean, just like this ridiculous experiment we're doing up here in the woods, all of those things represent a learning journey, which if one doesn't start because you defend the present and you'll never change, you never realize any of the things that you learn on the journey and get on to 2.0, 3.0, 5.0, et cetera, right? So that I think is something that also often gets lost in the debate. Lithium phosphate batteries. That's not a good solution. We shouldn't do that. Therefore, continue to burn fossil fuels. Well, that's a gateway. Where does it take us?
Yeah, and look, and then people will say, but, you know, a few years ago, we were told that diesels were better than petrol for the climate. And then we had compact fluorescent light bulbs. And I do agree. I absolutely agree that you've got to learn by doing. You've got to learn by doing. This idea that will come up somehow through lab research with some perfect solution, and it's just not going to happen. So you've got to do. And the challenge then is not to throw, how do you create almost it's about society and politics as much as anything else. How do you create a system that can learn? You know, how often have we seen governments run a pilot, and before the pilot has finished and been evaluated, they're already on to phase one of implementation? You know, because they never really, they don't really understand what is a pilot. What are you piloting? I mean, we've got this in the UK at the moment. There's about, I don't know how many houses in Fife in Scotland, they're going to do hydrogen heating. they will learn nothing, zero of any value. We already know you can have a hydrogen boiler.
Yeah.
We already know you can put it in a new pipe and carry hydrogen. We already know that you can cook a steak or a rasher of bacon on hydrogen. These are not new things. So they're doing it anyway and calling it a trial or a pilot. But if you ask them, what are you aiming to learn? The answer is complete silence. They don't know what they're trying to learn. They're just trying to do it for the sake of doing it. And what they're not doing is telling people that per unit of heat, hydrogen will cost 3 times as much as natural gas.
Yeah, interesting.
And they can insulate the pilot from that. They can tell the people in the pilot, but don't worry, you won't have to pay it.
Right.
But they don't want to tell anybody that, because then it becomes clear that you're not learning anything and you're working on a solution which is a priori stupid, that would drive up utility bills by 3.
Exactly.
And yet they're doing a pilot. Why?
Why do you think they are?
Oh,
why are they?
All to do with lobbying. You've got the gas industry is desperate to keep hope alive of a hydrogen future, not because they believe in it, but because that means that they don't have to address the fact that their pipes are worthless.
They'll have a fuel to transport in their pipes and sell.
And you have also, within the politics of it, you have the unions. So there's this very powerful union called the GMB. Well, the B stands for Boilermakers. And so to turn around and say, there'll be no boilers. The boilers have been great. Thank you, boilers, for all the warmth you've given us over the years, but there'll be no more boilers.
Right.
That is a political impossibility. And so you get this kind of, fake debate about heating solutions. I think pretty much everybody knows what's not going to work, but they still got to do a trial and a pilot up in Fife.
It keeps something alive a little bit longer. It makes it look like some progress is happening. So you can just barely see the smaller ski jump through the trees there, Michael. Yep. And I think the fog is going to come right to the ground.
I've skied those trails. I've skied those trails, yeah.
The famous Norwegian Holmenkollen 30Ks and 50Ks are where all kinds of, you mentioned that you were a skater. I was a skater when I grew up in Vermont.
Ski skater.
Exactly, cross-country ski skater. I was a member of the Bill Koch League.
Right.
Bill Koch maybe rings a bell?
First guy to skate in a World Cup.
Exactly.
Yep. Discussion about whether he should be disqualified.
And it was here.
Was it?
Yep. It was here. I don't know. What do you think? That we're going to have limited visibility and a steep slope and less light?
It'd be cool.
Keep going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Let's do it.
Sure. You know these woods.
Yeah.
I trust you. I've got decent shoes on.
Awesome. Yeah, this is a really cool spot because this particular stretch here feels almost a little bit like being in the mountains. And 25 minutes ago, we drove by the Norwegian Parliament, right? So it's a little bit of a unique situation to be in a European capital city and be able to live like this and do this ridiculous experiment we're doing, but also to be able to find natural surroundings like this.
Yep.
One of the things that I love about Oslo.
Oslo is great. I have actually come to Oslo for a ski weekend.
Okay.
So I came out here to do some ski training, cross-country ski training. So basically, when I competed, I was a mogul skier. I was a bump skier.
Yeah.
And then when I quit in 1993, so I took up cross-country skiing and some distance running, so half marathons.
Ah, cool.
And as part of that, I came here, and it was, as you say, jumping on the tram, I think it was, and coming out here, and then and there's just people on after school, they're like kids with skis on the tram or on the bus, and then plopping them on the snow and heading off into the hills. And I remember being enormously impressed. There were just like teenage school kids, not on not just like on their games consoles, but going off for a cross-country ski after school for fun. But it's great. I loved it.
Well,
and then staying in a downtown hotel and eating good food.
Having a little bit of a couple worlds, huh?
Yeah.
Exactly.
It was great.
Yeah. It's unique that way, right? And so shifting gears, so we don't just have a nice time walking in the woods, but we also do some of what we discussed as well. So before we had lunch, we were talking a little bit about how it's possible to create a reality that is supported by facts, but results in a different conclusion than somebody else who does the same thing, but with their interests in mind, right? And then you mentioned actually Bjorn Lomborg, which piqued my interest. And then there's been a series of articles over the past year or so. The most recent was maybe Bill Gates's note which cited Bloomberg, I believe. And then earlier this year, right, maybe one before the summer and one after, you called for what you called the pragmatic climate reset. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an intro to that, and then also comment on the Gates memo.
Yeah, so the pragmatic climate reset was actually spurred in part by a couple of other articles. So there was Dan Yergin wrote a piece called The Troubled Transition just ahead of CERA Week, the big oil and gas get together in Houston every year.
And during CERA Week, he declared a return to barrels.
Right. And that was picked up and very much sort of marketed and drawn on and amplified by the oil and gas industry and its various sort of, I want to say water carriers and fellow travelers and so on, but the whole kind of, the various commentators. Well, there was also a piece by Tony Blair who called for a reset.
Right.
And what's really fascinating is, they started to use this word pragmatic.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to think that I own the copyright on pragmatism with respect to the transition. I've got an advisory business called Ecopragma Capital, and my electric truck business is called Pragmacharge. So pragmatic is something that I feel very strongly about. We have to be pragmatic. Now, the question is, what does that involve? Because there is a pragmatism, the pragmatism of Dan Yergin was the transition is additive, can do a bit of this kind of clean energy stuff.
Yep.
You can have some electric cars if you're rich enough and so on. But pragmatically speaking, it's fossils that power the world. Tony Blair's version of pragmatism was direct air capture of CO2 and a lot of nuclear and CCS.
Right.
And, these are solutions that nobody who works on the stuff with momentum would call pragmatic. You can say, well, you have to do some of that because there are some hard to abate sectors or whatever.
Sure.
But you can't say that the pragmatism says we should focus on that. So, I wanted to reclaim the word pragmatic because to me, pragmatism is climate change is real. It may not be the most urgent problem in people's lives, but it is absolutely clear that accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere without limit is going to lead to catastrophe. And the catastrophe might take a long time to arrive because that's actually, one of the things that some of the, more excitable commentators will try and persuade us that, that we're going to die of climate change. There are indeed parts of the world where the impacts are absolutely being felt already. But the reality is that it's kind of a one problem amongst many, not the most urgent for most people, but it absolutely needs to be addressed. And pragmatic says that we address it with solutions that are affordable. We roll out solutions as we know that they work. So yes, it's good to experiment, but we don't go and roll out willy-nilly solutions that are not ready for prime time. We also pragmatism says that we don't focus on what we don't want. So you're not going to win by demonizing oil and gas companies. You're going to win by building the clean stuff. And in fact, trying to demonize oil and gas when that is what is keeping the lights on and that is what is keeping people warm. And that is what is, transporting people so they can, take their kids to school or fly home to visit their relatives or whatever it is. Demonizing and trying to shut things down is going to get such a pushback. And of course, that's what we see, that it will then interfere with the process. What we really need is just, you can call it clean energy abundance, right? There's this whole energy abundance movement. Yeah. Well, guess what? If we had clean energy abundance, affordable clean energy abundance, resilient affordable clean energy abundance, you wouldn't have to have a conversation about shutting down oil, gas, coal, whatever, because it would be the inferior solution and it would be forced off the system. So that was what I wrote about in the Pragmatic Climate Reset. I started with it's a two-parter, a huge thing, 10,000 words.
Yeah.
Nearly killed me writing it.
Nearly killed me reading it.
Yeah, I know. I apologize for that. Well, see, when I write about stuff, I still, although I sold new energy finance to Mike Bloomberg, whatever it is now, 2009, coming on for, gosh, it's going to be 17 years or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. I still write for them. And when I write, I really put heart and soul into trying to get my thoughts straight and provide, I don't want to call it the sort of the last word, but I want to write something that's going to stand the test of time, that says, here's an important topic and here's how I think about it. And I don't want to come back to it then in 6 months and go, oh, I didn't realize about this or that or the other. I'd really like to kind of, so that's what I tried to do, to encapsulate this moment in time, moment in history, a shift from the, 1.5 degrees, net zero 2050 globally, the kind of these very unrealistic approaches, and move to something that I think can be delivered. But in the first part of it, I also wanted to deal with these narratives. I wanted to deal with the idea that there is no feasible transition, that it's only ever additive and so on. When you start to really pass, the first one I opened up with was Dan Jurgen's piece. You start to kind of see, I don't want to call it the tricks.
Right.
But, you start to see kind of how the narrative is constructed that doesn't use fake numbers, but assembles them into a fake narrative.
Exactly.
And you see things like, you always see this word primary energy.
Primary.
And I've reached the point where primary energy, I mean, that is counting the lumps of coal and the gas out of the ground and the, and the oil. I've now reached the point where I think, whenever you see primary energy, then there's one of two things going on. Either the person who uses it does not know what it is, or they think you don't.
Or they're selling it, which they don't.
So they're hoping that you don't know that 2/3 of primary energy is wasted. And importantly, it's not wasted because people are profligate or stupid, or because technologies are, unevolved. It's wasted because of the thermodynamics of solving problem X with a fuel.
Yep.
If you want to have an elevator going up and down in your building, you need electricity. So if you start with, doesn't matter whether it's natural gas or whether it's coal or whether it's, a liquid fuel, to get that elevator going up and down in your building, there are losses involved. I wouldn't even necessarily call it waste. There are losses.
There are losses. Right.
And so, if what you really want is an elevator going up and down in your building, it's just a better, more elegant solution to go straight to electricity. Solar, wind, hydro, and, nuclear is thermal, but not in the same way. It doesn't use fuel and doesn't, pollute and make and cause climate change in the same way.
Exactly.
So the moment you start saying primary energy, the moment you see that, your spidey sense should basically be saying, somebody's trying to fool me here.
Somebody's trying to fool me. Somebody's
profiting. So that's common to all these narratives.
So can I ask you a question about that? Because, and here we're coming up on Pugamirhitta, which, I mean, I'm not Norwegian, right? So bird, marsh, cabin.
Right.
Something roughly like that. Designed by Snøhetta, the same architecture firm that is responsible for some of the, one of the big streets in New York City. I can't remember, is it Broadway? That's now more sitting and cafes.
Okay.
And so, but the question, there was a little bit of listening to Cleaning Up, as I do often, is always fun because of the dynamic between you and Brian, also your co-host. And I believe it was when you were doing part 2, because you did 2 episodes on Cleaning Up, one on each part of the pragmatic climate reset, right? And at one point she asked you, but Michael, aren't you being a little bit easy on the oil and gas companies? Have worked with a number of them from a number of years, 4 or 5 years, on this type of topic. Have never met any stupid people, and met a lot of good people, but have met also people who are extremely intelligent and are making a lot of money. And one question that I have is, and Dan Jurgen, is Dan Jurgen a serious person?
Dan is a mentor of mine. I'm not sure he's still talking to me, but he's a mentor of mine. He's a great guy.
Great guy, very serious person. Yep. Doesn't do things by mistake, probably. He's a wise person. He literally wrote the book on the history of energy as we know it today, right? At least the first chapters. And then, like, as we take the primary energy fallacy as an example, one of the things that fascinates me about it is not only are they maybe trying to fool you when the narratives come across the way that you've described, they've also managed to charge for the product before the losses happen.
Yes.
So there is an amazing, probably the most successful business model in the history of humanity that's behind this. And while you're right that it's keeping many of the lights on, it's definitely keeping us warm, right? I think there's also a fear among a lot of people here that everything is not as it seems, and there are some very powerful forces that are, and the word that you often use is parasitic. Sorry, the delay word, help me.
Predatory
Delay, right? That they're so that if we don't push back against those forces at all, they'll run away with the whole game.
Right. So push back, absolutely, and I do, against the predatory delay, and I've done it very, very publicly. So as an example, Aston Martin, there was a leaflet that was published by some think tank that said that electric vehicles are worse for the climate than internal combustion.
Exactly.
And I discovered that the leaflet, the think tank, they had one director who was the wife of the government relations guy from Aston Martin. Right. And we think allegedly the funding was provided by Robert Bosch, who provides the fuel injection systems and lots of components for internal combustion vehicles. And I was very vocal about that. Yeah. And I tried to cause as much trouble as possible. Another example in the UK, the Gas Heating Association. There's this thing called the Energy Utilities Alliance, which sounds tremendously sort of public spirited. All of its members, almost all, are gas-related heating players. There's a few municipalities, a couple of other things. And they were caught because they had funneled money from their various members into a PR campaign that was designed to, air quotes, spark outrage about heat pumps. And I made a big fuss. And I continue to make a fuss about that because I think it's utterly disgusting. I mean, you know, you wouldn't think in this day and age, with what we know about climate change, what we know about, you know, heat pumps as part of one of the very few really big tools against that, then you wouldn't think that that would just sort of pass. I mean, not so much unnoticed, but that if it's noticed, that it wouldn't cause, you know, some kind of repercussions.
Boy,
it's little mouse, wood mouse.
What are you doing outside of my house?
Cold mouse, you need a little of that good natural gas heating.
Sorry. So at this point here, we can see that there's a city down there ever so vaguely.
Yep. So we got to push back against predatory delay. Absolutely. But there's a difference between the predatory delay and all oil and gas companies and all the people who work in them. And I cannot demonize a product that I use. I just don't think that that is ethical.
Right.
I can try to use less of it, and I could try to work on the systems to replace it, but demonizing it, I just think it's, I mean, so there's a sort of, is it effective question?
Sure.
And there's an, is it ethical or, and moral, you know, is that an appropriate behavior? I mean, the pragmatic climate reset, I'm just saying it's not, look, it's not working. It's very satisfying to demonize oil and gas companies. And, you know, your tribe, if you're a climate activist, they're going to love you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But for the average person who knows that you need gas to heat their home because they haven't got the $20,000 or whatever it is to switch to a heat pump, it just comes across as really kind of irritating, frankly, sanctimonious, irritating.
About OGCI.
So OGCI, meaning the
oil and gas.
I had an interesting conversation with them very early on because I went in to see them. And this is, for those who, you know, maybe some of the audience won't know, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, it's essentially a consortium of big oil and gas companies. They do two things. They were, I think, kind of acting as a platform for the companies to talk about climate in a safe space for themselves. You know, fine, they need to do that.
Sure.
The other thing is they put together this fund. I think it was originally $1 billion, might be, and it's now sort of semi-independent. I believe it's kind of got some external funding. And they invited me in and talked through what they're investing in. And I was very supportive. If it's energy efficiency on the demand side, then I'm very supportive. They should invest. They should push that. If it was carbon capture and storage, I'm okay with that, right? We're going to need some, so I'm okay with it. Where I differed with them back then was they were also working on energy efficiency in the production of fossil fuels. And I pointed out that, of course, if they succeed in that, they're actually prolonging the life of their assets. So if they make it cheaper to extract more, then we're going to basically extract more.
Exactly.
So actually, if they succeed in energy efficiency of extraction, in the end, that'll be worse for the climate. And the individuals involved very much disagreed with this analysis, which, as far as I'm concerned, is bleeding obvious. And so we sort of parted ways. I've never worked with them, and I won't, because as long as they're I won't if they're still investing in that sort of thing.
I mean, because there's CCS, and then there's CCS for the purposes of enhanced oil recovery.
Yeah, because whenever anybody injects the CCUS. You have to ask, what's the U? And it turns out to be enhanced oil recovery. In other words, it's a self-licking ice cream.
It's a self-licking ice cream.
From a climate perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah, because what they want to do is capture the carbon dioxide, and then use some of it to, essentially extract more oil, make more money, and pump more into the atmosphere. So that's not something that I'm going to be too excited about.
How's the walk been?
It's good. It's hard to talk about the pragmatic uphill climate reset. Slightly out of breath, but I think I'm doing okay.
Doing super well. And it's not only simple walking. So,
but you're talking about the demonization. Also, the point of sort of departure with Bryony. I think Bryony's first of all, she was originally an activist, and then she was a civil servant working as the lead author of the UK's Climate Change Act, and then became Baroness Worthington. So her heritage is much more sort of activisty. Although what I love about her approach is she actually wants to she's an activist for solutions. So although on that point she says, you're being too easy on the oil and gas companies, actually what she really wants to do is push solutions, which is why we get on so great.
Which I think is awesome. And I think, I've been referred to in the past as a critical friend, and being able to have a conversation, even when the viewpoints are different, and push each other around, but be clear on trying to achieve the same thing, which sometimes happens. And it's special is definitely more of what we need. Right?
But I think also on that, going back to the point is that we just got to be kind of nuanced. That have the oil and gas companies, do they get a get out of jail free card? No, absolutely not. They have behaved appallingly and tried to confuse, and all of that whole Exxon knew, and there's no question. However, you've got to be able to kind of put that in one side, and then you've got to say, well, look, if you want to have, for the next couple of decades, warm homes, fly around to places, et cetera, you're going to have to work with them. But also some of the solutions. I mean, we use fertilizer, right? Fertilizer is going to be made using the Haber-Bosch process for decades. Who is going to be able to do that? It's going to be big fertilizer companies and big, oil and gas companies, So what is the point of just pissing them off, raising the stakes, and making really extreme statements that are so easily debunked? Because that's a lot of what happens on the other side. So it's complicated. It's just complicated.
It definitely is.
That's why you need to have the dialogues, and to be able to kind of work with people you don't fully agree with.
Absolutely.